Yeah, I still have the cast. Hi there, and welcome everybody to Cast Iron Thursday. I had mentioned that the usual Cast Iron Wednesday chat had to be postponed for one day, really due to personal reasons, or more like work reasons. They schedule me on a work pager once a week, and last night just happened to be the night for it. So, and unfortunately, unlike a lot of these people trying to make a living off of these YouTube channels, I work a full-time job. Let me clarify that. A lot of people who are, yeah, I do work a full-time job. This is more like a hobby here, but no disrespect to those people who are trying to make an actual living off of these YouTube videos. And that's one reason why the production values on my videos are unfortunately a lot lower than some of the ones there where it is their full-time job, and they literally spend all day and weekend and so forth putting really wonderful polish on their videos, and I'm actually quite jealous of that. Yeah, as I mentioned, yeah, the cast is still here. For the record, as you can see, we are down to a wrist cast now, and oh man, does this ever feel good, because I'm actually able to bend my arm and do other fun things like that. They said my wrist is coming along nicely, and the next doctor's appointment to check on this, maybe take the cast off for good, is a week from tomorrow, a week from Friday. So I'm still stuck in this for at least the next week and a half or so. But never mind that. You're not here to talk. You're not here to hear me whine about my wrist. You are here for me to whine about cast iron. And yeah, that's why the subject for this evening, as I mentioned, and that's why I named this tonight's chat "S.O.S. in a UFO on a POS stove." Yeah, S.O.S., as we all know, I mean, that is a dish simple enough that you could probably make it with one hand, which is what I'm going to be doing. And there we are, UFO. Now, that is a term that I've heard on one of the cast iron groups as a joke several years back, and I loved it because it is such a perfect description, really, of what these pans are, namely unidentified frying objects. And yes, I know that's been used as a joke, yuck, 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 but really, I mean, it is so accurate because what we are talking about, in fact, are unknown cast iron pans, ones that we have not been able to identify, at least not yet. And those pans are really all over the place. There are many different origins, many different styles of those unknown cast iron pans, and they are, quite frankly, wonderful to cook with, just like any other cast iron pan, except a lot of them are vintage pans too, which means they're also very, very smooth. So definitely, if you own one of those pans, the best I could say is use it with pride. So, and nonetheless, it's really, I think that's one thing I wanted to start out by saying, is how the internet has changed everything. Because really, I mean, especially over the past decade or so, we've been doing a lot of research into the history of these pans, and so a lot of these pans really are not as unknown as they used to be. Like, for instance, up until only recently, this would have been considered an unknown, because it is, again, a completely blank cast iron pan, and really anybody, especially antique vendors, really would have no idea what this thing is, except that thanks to internet research, we've been able to identify this particular one as a square skillet. Boy, that took a lot of research. Made by Birmingham Stove and Range during its Century Series era, meaning it could have been manufactured anywhere from the late 1960s all the way to the 1990s or so. The clue, of course, really, and I have to put this down, is not the fact that this actually has a blank back, but rather from the unique shape of the handle, where BSR produced a series of several types of pans during their Century era that had this very unique handle. It's slightly curved. It still has that ridge on the bottom, and it has a very oval shaped hanging handle to it. So that is what really identifies this as a BSR. It's actually unusual that this pan is completely blank on the underside, but this is not unique. There have been others of this that have been seen to be completely blank. But nonetheless, until only recently, that would have been considered an unknown pan. And in fact, that's what they were selling a lot of those pans for on eBay up until they were actually discovered. You know, a lot of them were just unknown or unmarked pans, or a rare vintage made in USA pan or the like. Even so, there are still, again, a great deal, many pans out there where we still do not know their origins, and we may very well never know because they have been lost in the midst of time. And they were often made by small foundries, or perhaps even by prison labor. I mean, that's a rumor that goes around on several of the more popular unknown cast iron pans, that prison labor may very well have been used by some foundries. And the reason why they think that it's possible that some of these pans may have been made in prison work programs is because just that. Some of those pans, there are a great many of them out there. I mean, quite a lot of them, and they're actually fairly easy to find. And yet, no one seems to have any records of where they came from. So the rumor is that they may have been made in prisons. But there's never been any actual documented evidence of this. I mean, there is evidence that, yes, in fact, cast iron foundries did use prison workers. In fact, BSR actually did that. They used conscript workers during the early days, for instance. But there's no proof that any of those particular ones were made by prisoners. So politics behind prison labor is a completely different subject, one that I'm not interested in getting into because that has to do with history and politics. Now, okay, hey, look at this. Unlike last week, my live chat hasn't been disrupted, and I can actually see the comments here. Hello, Bookworm73, Amajo, JD Hive 4, Time's Up. Made cake mix in my WW12 and used my homemade vanilla and frosting. Oh, Wagner ware. Wow, in a 12? Wow, that's a nice sized pan there. Hello, Bookworm and Raymond from Jessica T. and Donnie Hawkins. Does anyone here know anything about King Stove and Range? I have to be honest, that's not really a name I'm very familiar with. If you're talking about a skillet or a pan with that name, King Stove and Range, the best I could say is, well, do some research, meaning look on Google, especially in places like the Cast Iron Collector website, because they would probably have some record of it. That's just it. A lot of those small foundries made small batches of pans. Some of them do actually have a manufacturer mark and have been identified over time, and some have not. Brian Smith, what is your real job that allows you to afford all your iron? Well, all I will say about that is that in my real job, I'm a cubicle slave. I work at a corporation, meaning that I actually have a desk, a phone. I talk to customers. And all I will say is that everything, and I mean everything, in Dilbert, in the office, in Office Space, it's all true. Every word of it, even the part where you can get darned to heck for minor sins. It's all true. But yeah, because of that, I mean, I actually, I make enough to live on at least, and enough to be able to splurge on this hobby. So, I still try not to go too far out of my way as far as cast iron, as far as collecting cast iron is concerned. And I've sworn that all of these pans are users, if at all possible. Hello, Mike Hall. What's the best chicken frying cast iron? Hope you heal up soon. Well, thank you. The best chicken frying, well, you could use a chicken fryer, you could use a Dutch oven, or you could use a large deep fryer or a cast iron skillet. Best I could say, I think, is that a large pan works best for frying chicken because you've got a lot of space, and because it really does take a lot of effort to fry chicken. I mean, it's better, that way because again, you've got a lot of space and you can fry up a large amount of chicken at a time in a batch. So if you're gonna fry chicken, definitely go big. I thought you were a volunteer fireman or EMT. No, I'm afraid I have never been an EMT or anything. It's one of those things. It would be nice to, but no, I never have been. I'm sorry. Okay, have you seen Skillet with a gate mark with an inset number? Well, let me see. Would you be referring to one of these, perhaps? Here is an example, and I think I will probably, after this, change over to a view of the pans here rather than a view of my ugly face. But one second, let me get a close-up of this handle here because it's a good place to start, I think. Namely that quite a few folks out there, no doubt, have a pan with a handle like this, because these are very common pans from almost certainly from the 19th century. You can tell, of course, because of the gate mark on the back. This particular letter A and is generally believed, and I see no reason not to, that is an accessory that came with a cast iron stove. I mean, a full-blown wood-burning stove. Back in those days, it was quite common that if you made the expense and invested in a wood-burning stove, the store or the manufacturer would include a complimentary set of cookware with it, which means you get a whole set of cast iron cookware. You'd get a small skillet, a large skillet, a stove, a kettle like this one here, for instance, a griddle, who knows? It, of course, depended on the manufacturer and what they had available. And so for a lot of them, they simply used simple markings A, B, and C to tell what was what. So that A was the small skillet, B was the larger skillet, C was the griddle, D was the kettle, and so on and so on. So these things here were really considered to be throwaway pans. They were made cheap and thin, and that's one reason why those particular style of pans, well, number one is that they are so wonderfully light and thin because they were made cheaply, and that's also why they're gate marked on the bottom, because really the manufacturers didn't really care about that. As far as they were concerned, those were disposable items. And yet there's a nice piece of irony for you. Let me start getting the view down here for some of these pans, including this one here that I'm heating up. That's the irony, is that a number of these pans are still being used in kitchens today, whereas unfortunately those big wood burning stoves, many or most of them, have been lost, because of progress. So even though they're disposable, they are still easy to find today. So Glock 30 fan, should you cook fish in separate pans that you cook other stuff due to the smell setting into the seasoning? Well, yes and no. Yes, fish does make a lot of, does have a very strong scent, and it can indeed get into the seasoning. Of course, what you could do is maybe once in a while, you stick that used pan into the oven at like 400 to 500 degrees for an hour and give it another coating of seasoning, because anything, anything organic on it, like the fish residue, will burn off or burn into a new layer of seasoning. And when it comes out of the oven, then the pan really should not smell of anything. So on the other hand, there's no reason not to just keep a fish pan, for instance. Frankly, this pan here, this gate mark here, which I call lucky number 7, is I use it almost exclusively for making cornbread, for instance. And having said that, okay, let's take a look as well at this other pan here. This one here, they simply call these fancy handle pans because that's really all they know about them. It is likely that one or more manufacturers made a set of these kind of pans that are extremely thin. This may be the lightest large cast iron pan I've ever held. It's very, very thin and light. It's also quite hot because I've been heating it up because I'm going to be cooking in this. And it's got a nice fancy design on the handle to it. It also has a gate mark on the bottom, and let me see. Even though this pan is hot, let me do this right here. There we go. It also has a gate mark on the bottom, as you can see. It's also actually rather warped. This thing is really a spinner here, especially because it was so thin. It was obviously warped from decades of use and probably abuse. But anyway, there are a number of pans out there with these fancy handles, and that's all we know about them. And they just simply call them fancy handle pans, except because they were so light and don't have any markings on them, these were probably also, like these other ones, part of a cookware set that probably was considered just disposable and throwaway. Regardless of that, I'm going to be putting this through its pace in just a little bit. But before we do so, let me go on to this the other part here. And that, of course, would be this stovetop kettle, which, again, they made many of these kettles as part of those stove kits. In this one here, I use as a utensil crock, as you can see. This one I acquired at Brimfield, and I think I paid $20 for it. So it was covered with green paint, and I spent a full week really restoring this thing through electrolysis, through several layers of seasoning, and it turned out pretty darn good. And then, unfortunately, I never used it. I mean, it's a really nice pot here, but I mean, I've got enough Dutch ovens and pots in my kitchen that I really rarely had any use for this at all. And because of this, maybe going on about 3 years ago, along with a bunch of my other cast iron, I took it and took it to a flea market and set up a booth to sell some of my excess cast iron, including this. I set up that booth at about 6:30 in the morning, Sunday morning, when flea markets are getting set up. By 7:30, one of the major cast iron dealers from Brimfield, no less, swooped down on my stand and snatched up a whole bunch of my pieces. After which point, then only about half an hour later, he came back again and almost completely cleaned me out. I think I had maybe 20 pieces at my stand, and there were maybe 3 left over that he did not take. But he didn't take, he bought them. So, and my intention was to get rid of them. So I really didn't have any complaints about that. This he left behind. Even he did not see any use for it. And so because of that, I really have had no other choice but to really use this as a utensil crock, because I really have not had any other use for it. That's how it is. But as I said, I am trying to make a user out of this as much as possible. So anyway, I think I will get started doing some cooking here, and we will continue to talk about, there we are. We will talk about vintage cast iron, because there are many other pieces here that we can look at, like, for instance, these ugly hammered pans here. Nonetheless, one other thing before I get started here. Paw Dan, were foundries all over the U.S. in the 1800s, or just located in the Midwest and South? They were definitely all over the country, north, south, east, west. There were a number of small foundries, even here in New England, for instance. I have actually seen Dutch ovens and other items from foundries in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and even Maine, and even the Boston area. So yeah, manufacturing was a real big industry all over the country in the 1800s and the 1900s. And in fact, I mean, it's been pointed out that one of the reasons why, quite frankly, the North won the Civil War was because we had far more in the way of manufacturing facilities than the South did. And I'm not going to get into North-South politics, not after 150 years. I'm just 100, more than 150 years. I'm just simply stating history, and we're only going to leave it at that. If you want to sell the big pot, no, actually, I'm sorry. I generally don't sell my cast iron, and no offense. Let me see. Thanks, Paw Dan. Nice score, Bookworm 73. I found a gate mark kettle at the flea market for $8 that I use for utensils as well. Well, again, congratulations. Okay, but enough of congratulations. I've got to turn on the stove here, or the fan. Ugh. And let's get something going here. Time now to brown us up, make us up some sausage. Because as I said, the title of this video is S.O.S. in a UFO on a POS stove. Those of you who have seen my stove, you understand what I'm talking about here. Oh, by the way, look at this. Looks like it's a... I'm sorry? Yes. And a PO'd roommate. Yeah. Interesting thing, I guess. Okay. Here is an example, by the way, of what happens when you cook with a warped cast iron skillet. I mean, the edges are not nearly as hot as the center, and as a result, it developed a hot spot in the center, and because of that, at least initially, I might even want to turn this down a little bit because it's sausage, and I've really got to cook this thoroughly, and I don't want to burn it. So the center developed a hot spot where, at least initially, the sausage was beginning to stick. Fortunately, this thing is giving off enough grease here that I don't think sticking is going to be any problem. So look at this. We've got a cast iron skillet here that's maybe 120, 140 years old, and it still cooks like a charm. Warped or not, it may be a spinner. Oh, one other thing. As I mentioned, I found both of these at Brimfield several years ago. Boy, it's already been that long. And when I cleaned them up, I found out that both of them actually were cracked. This one here, in fact, had two cracks. A very small crack somewhere over here, and a much more noticeable crack right here. I did not want to give these pans up. I did not want to throw them out. I don't know, maybe because they were the oldest pans I had ever owned at the time. But for whatever reason, I actually took the time to have them repaired. I found a professional welder living in not too far from here in central Massachusetts who agreed to actually take these pans and weld them up. And he was a real professional, too. He used nickel welds, and when he was done with them, you could barely tell where the welds were. In this case here, you can see this part here. It looks as though maybe the seasoning has come off and exposed the nickel weld. But other than that, really, there's no indication at all that the pan was cracked. So I'm actually quite happy with that. And that was the same with my number 7 as well. There was a large crack in it. I had it welded, and you can only barely see. In fact, you can't see, not the way I'm holding it. You can only barely see right about here. If I can even get the light right on this side here. Anyway, as I said, you can barely see where this thing was welded. Now I better not drop it, otherwise I could crack it again. Shit. So that answers the question, can you weld cast iron? Yes, you can, but it's very difficult. I was lucky to find a professional guy because a lot of welders and car dealers, car repairs and so forth, they will refuse to weld cast iron cookware. It's just too fragile, just too difficult. And even then, a lot of times the welds really are very, very noticeable. You can still cook with them, but again, it's hardly... I lucked out and had a really nice job at this. Boy, this is not taking long at all. I'll tell you that much too. Granted, it's not a lot of sausage either, but looks like this S.O.S. here is not going to take very long at all. So anyway, what do we have now? Your kettle would make a perfect chili pot. Oh, I don't doubt that. No, yes. Why don't you don't use any additional oil for sausage? Well, as you can see, this particular sausage here gave off a lot of grease on its own. So even though initially there was some sticking in the center with this hot spot, but that did not last long at all. Now we've got some nice, really crumbled sausage here, and it's... And this pan here has done a very nice job. Boy, you can see the way this thing wobbles. It's so much of a spinner that even on my electric stovetop, you can see how this thing is wobbling as I use it. And yet it still has cooked this sausage pretty nice, pretty darn good. And for the record, my stovetop here setting is only at like number 4. I'm not even at halfway on my stovetop. So even though I call this a POS stove, as you can see, at least this burner does a pretty good job heating up cast iron. Anyway, William Hertz. So nickel weld is safe for cooking. I've had good luck welding cast iron woodworking implements. My understanding, well, no, not just my understanding. Yes, it is safe. I mean, after all, nickel is not the same as, say, lead, for instance. So yes. What can I say? I am not a professional welder or a metallurgist or anything like that, but I do understand that, and I'm not the only one too. Others who have had their cast iron welded, they've used nickel welds, and it's done a good job here. I'm a welder. Hello, time's up. Aluminum and stainless steel and mild steel, but no cast iron. Yeah, I know, I understand, and I'm not disrespecting you by saying that. As I said, cast iron is not easy to weld, so... let me see. Well, I'm glad folks like the kettle, yeah. Anyway, those are just some examples of very common cast iron that they used back in the 19th century. Even then, of course, the earliest days of Griswold and Wagner and some other foundries as well were producing some very nice cast iron. There was one foundry in the Pennsylvania area called Marietta, and there are a lot of pans out there even now with the Marietta logo on them. I've seen some of them. They also made glue pots, and they made some very big cooking pots as well. Once at a flea market in Pennsylvania outside Harrisburg, I saw this wonderful 12-inch Marietta skillet that was selling for $50. I was sorely tempted, but I was telling myself that day, really, I do not need any more skillets. And, well, it would have been nice to own. To be honest, yeah, I really don't know if I need any more skillets. Boy, I'd say this sausage is definitely cooked up. It's time to get going here. Which means, as you know, S.O.S. gotta have a lot of grease or fat in the pan. In fact, I hope I didn't put in too much. Not taking long to melt either. And while we're waiting, let's try to do two things at once and bring up this, as I mentioned already. If we move forward a couple of decades,